Wow, that was a day, wasn't it, guys? I mean, come on. Group B was supposed to be free for RNG and Gen G. RNG sat poised 3-0 at the end of the first round and only had to win one game and ended up, in the end, playing a tiebreaker against Cloud9, the team everyone had as last place in the group, to get out in first. Not just to get out, but to get out in first. Cloud9 was the first team to garner enough wins to manage to qualify for the quarterfinals. If that isn't enough, if you're a Western fan, Vitality managed to 2-0 Gen G and went 1-1 with Royal Never Give Up, making them the team with the best record against the two group favorites going in. All of that culminated into what really felt like a tiebreaker between the two dominant teams of the day, between Vitality and Cloud9, to decide which Western team would be the first to make it out. I knew I wanted to do a video about this game because this is probably the meta-defining game of the group stage, or at least this particular group, because you really have the hard engage side and the pick side combined with very good disengage, very good counter engage. I didn't really know how to do it without being a dick. Because as soon as you look at the draft, you know it's a really difficult game for Team Vitality. And it felt a lot like this team had gone so far and done so well, having such a great record against Gen G and RNG, that they tripped over what many analysts considered beforehand to be the easiest obstacle in the group.
You thinking what I'm thinking, partner? Aim for the bushes.
But that doesn't mean that this game was completely decided in draft. It also doesn't mean that there weren't ways for Vitality to actually play out their composition that we can go over and sort of learn from. Also, it doesn't mean that this game wasn't extremely significant on both sides and that there aren't things that we can learn and sort of go over and understand from both sides, making this not just an exaggeration, but potentially the best Western game that we'll see at this World Championship. So let's go back to the draft. The first thing that you'll be able to notice if you're familiar with either of these teams is that these are the quintessential Cloud9 and Team Vitality drafts. You quite possibly cannot get any better than this if you want to go player for player in terms of comfort, as well as just compositions they're sort of familiar with and understand how to play out to some degree. So the first thing to point out is that under normal circumstances, Vitality probably cannot teamfight this in the mid to the late game. They really want to get their bottom lane ahead, which is why they go ahead first part of the game, set up this level 1 invade, even bother to invest Cabashard's Flash, because they really, really want Draven and Thresh to be able to snowball so far out of control that they have pressure in the mid lane that's kind of a passive sort of pressure. Because we'll talk in more detail about how Cloud9 and Vitality want to set up in the mid game when we get to a relevant clip, but until then, just know that if you're C9, you want to get ahead on your Singed and your Nocturne, and if you're Vitality, you want to get ahead on your bottom lane, as we already pointed out, and your Echo. Obviously, if you're Zillion, it's also really nice to have a little bit of extra gold early on, so I would say that the first blood that C9 ended up getting due to Vitality's overcommit helps a lot, because a little bit more itemization early on, your Q scales pretty well as like a 0.9 ratio, so you're able to push really competitively and you don't feel as under threat from Echo before you get your ultimate. So it is nice that went ahead for C9 and they're pretty happy with that, but ultimately, you know, their goal is going to be kind of their Singed and their Nocturne. With that in mind, this is really, for me, kind of the most significant moment where things go a bit wrong for C9, because you have Vitality really, really committing to this turret. I feel like Vitality can play this a bit more slowly because they're getting stacks on their Draven. That's very useful. Eventually they'll be able to cash that in for a really good boost of gold for him, but they commit really hard to this turret. And instead you see a lot of Cloud9's composition really shining through, right? You have the power of C9's disengage and re-engage tools really punishing Vitality's overall tendency to overcommit. The fact that they're up so far on this turret, the fact that C9 are able to engage from a very long distance, the fact that you have double TPs on C9, we talked about this a little bit in group stage in terms of things that went bad for C9 against Detonation Focus Me, but you have a lot of tools on C9 to just like really so far down that lane Vitality were, and then to be safe they had to completely retreat past their own turret and ended up losing 2 for it. And obviously the 2 members who came away with kills in that engage were Singed and Nocturne. What does the ideal setup for Cloud9 and Team Vitality look like? Well, this I think is a pretty good example of how things sort of go wrong for Team Vitality and why it's a bit difficult for them to play out the game the way they want to. If you're Cloud9, partly because you can see this on the TP, that clues me in that you want to do a 4-1 type composition with Zilean constantly moving from mid to top to catch waves. Just to catch waves, because really he just kind of wants to be around mid to be able to help clear mid with Sneaky, to help protect Sneaky, because that gives Sneaky a lot of peel and a lot of safety. Just not only does he have his ultimate, which makes him untargetable, but he has the Shen ultimate, he has Shen taunt, which is a good peel and the damage reduction. You also have Zilean speed up, you have Zilean's ability to ult him, and he's just a very, very sort of safe Xayah as long as Zilean is nearby. You also want Nocturne to kind of be doing this rotation to the point where it's almost like a 2-2-1 at times, because you want for Nocturne to be able to shadow Zilean every time he catches wave in case there's an opportunity to make a pick on Vitality's 1-3-1 split pusher over here. So that's kind of the ideal scenario for C9. Because of the matchup with Sion and Singed, because this is kind of a scenario where both Sion and Singed will want to push to river, because at a point Singed can't really do much to the Sion, and it just becomes kind of a minion wave clear off because of Sion's MR, and because if he dodges the E, then Sion's a pretty happy camper overall. It's kind of a minion clear fest, and both want to just go mid after that and engage, and whoever gets the best engage is kind of the winner of the top lane 1v1 in this case. And you can't really, if you're Vitality, assign Echo to match the Singed, because I would say Echo has a worse time against the Singed than the Sion does in general. So that's the case, but if Sion and Singed play that game, Singed most likely will always win because of what I said with how safe Xayah is. By contrast, Draven is really not at all safe, especially because you have a scenario where your Nocturne can get pretty far ahead. He's right on his way to a Black Cleaver, and he's building to one-shot this Draven, who isn't a very mobile Draven. His best peel is going to be the Thresh Lantern, and he's doesn't have a Zilean ultimate. He doesn't have a Shen ultimate. The most he has is a frontline, and this Trundle Pillar is not going to do anything really for the dive coming out from the Nocturne as long as the Nocturne is ahead. So, or coming out from the Shen, like the Shen Nocturne combo, any of this, it's really, really easy comparatively for C9 to get on to the AD carry for Vitality than for Vitality to do the opposite. So Vitality wants to play this mid lane setup extremely safe with their 3 here, to the point where, you maybe are using Draven's ultimate to clear wave, and you want to kind of juggle your top laner so that you're pecking at these turrets really, and if people are moving to collapse on Echo, if Nocturne is pulling the trigger to collapse on Echo, you can move forward and jump on this turret, because Echo still has some good tools for dealing with Nocturne. Obviously the ult, obviously a sort of option, so it's not the end of the world. And this is why Echo is like kind of the saving grace of Vitality's draft, and why Echo was a decent last pick for where they had pigeonholed themselves. But overall, it's harder to execute, but there are options. So Let's talk a little bit about what happens here and why I feel like C9's had the better execution and Vitality's execution was off. We have members of C9 moving down here. You have pretty good wards from Vitality where they are, so that they're aware of C9's movements, which is why this part, what they did here is so bad. They're very, very far up. You know, if they weren't far up, if they had just kind of moved over, gotten some damage on the turret, and then backed out, and waited for the next wave, waited for Zillion to clear this wave, and waited for all of C9 to kind of move top, as I mentioned before, to deal with Echo. This is better. Or if they committed, and if Vitality backed out further and they committed and they couldn't commit, then Echo gets this turret, and Echo can continue pushing and having pressure there and doesn't have to TP. So this is kind of the big mistake and why it's so difficult to execute Vitality's comp. I don't always think that 1-3-1 comps or 1-4 comps are difficult to execute, but here I think C9's answer is actually really, really good. And they play it very well.
The teleports in, into the front line, they go, taunts in, the stuns coming across, who will be the first kill? Jack Troll will drop a Svenskaren as well, a giant stun, will they catch Zazel? He'll be revived by Jensen, and we're in a 4v4 across the map, Jizuke jumping away, but he's burned most of his cooldowns. Can there be a chase? A great pillar for Gekkas means no, as the solo kill finally came through for Licorice, a 2-for-1 trade for C9, as mid lane turret stays on.
I think part of the reason why Vitality ended up playing it out that way is because if you just look at their team fight composition in general, it's just really hard for anyone on Vitality to get to the back line except for Jizuke. So you had some good moments where Vitality were clearly looking to force some kind of engage when both of the TPs were down, when they were funneled into kind of a narrow corridor where he could easily get past the front line and jump out with the ultimate. Of course, he got 2 picks off during a very key moment, and Vitality were really desperate, really scrambling to the point where they felt like they needed to rush Baron. And, well, that didn't go well for them, partly because of the way that Cloud9's composition works and why it's so good in certain scenarios, specifically against teams like Vitality, specifically against teams to an extent like RNG, and why this game was so pivotal in my mind. Composition really do at the crux of it. What it does is it disengages and re-engages. So you commit to one target and you have the Zillion ult to reset the scenario, and suddenly every other member of C9 can come in very quickly and collapse. This type of composition and this type of setup is going to be very good against teams that either overextend in a play, overextend on the map, or just don't know when to back, you know? We talked a little bit about how IG versus G-Rex, IG were playing a little bit fast and loose with their resets, and they had ways that kind of worked for them. But I feel like a composition like this would work really well into what IG were trying to do there to an extent. If you're backing a little late, if you're engaging far forward to kind of catch up with the fact that the enemy team hasn't backed yet when they should have, things of that nature, then I feel like Cloud9 can just reset whatever fight that is going to take place and make sure that they stall out and make something happen, or make a trade for at least 1-for-1, which is what they were doing quite a bit in the RNG versus C9 game. And honestly, until that Baron fight at the end, I really just thought C9 were going to win it and be the first North American team to ever come out first in their group since, I think, season 1 there was a team that did it, but it's honestly, it's season 1. European fans have to give that up. Fnatic's win doesn't count. But Kelsey, that doesn't explain why you think this is potentially the most important game at the tournament so far and could end up being meta-defining. Well, you have to think a little bit about how the group stage started between RNG and Vitality. You had a situation where RNG were playing double tank champions that didn't necessarily have a lot of damage outside of a hyperscaling AD carrying Kai'Sa, and then they wanted to wait it out. RNG kind of took this approach as a way to deal with a team they thought would overcommit, most likely, because what RNG have been doing is, we can take lanes like Tristana or Khan that don't get a lot of damage in lane and should probably fall behind 30 CS, but then we have a jungle gank at level 2, level 3, and we can just sort of outplay, and it doesn't matter if they're playing a really heavy commit composition because we can just scale and take over at an early point. Vitality responded to that by just committing even harder. doubling down with things like Rise that can chase really far with the ultimate. You have the Thresh, Draven, you had Scion, which is really, really good at just like getting directly to your AD carry in the backline. You had the Xin Zhao dive potential really, really strong. So Vitality countered to what RNG had kind of tried to set the meta as, with even harder, deeper diving, which made Cloud9's sort of unique approach perfect. Of course, Cloud9 developed this in NA, where everyone just pushes through mid as far as they can. A little joke, sorry guys. But, you know, you also see C9 developing more varied strategies. They played very smart 1-3-1 map pressure against Gen G. Obviously, it's Gen G, but it was still very nice to watch. But against teams like Vitality that would overcommit, they went for this more Zillion-centric mobile AD carry approach that could reset fights and re-engage. RNG, this is why it's so important, is that RNG sort of copied the Vitality approach. They went with Kalista. They went with champions like Lissandra. They went with champions that will super hard engage and go even further and deeper in than Vitality's champions. And C9 punished them for it pretty well. They turned almost everything into 1-for-1s, as I said earlier. So to me, this is really kind of the exchange of what the meta developed to today, and we saw C9 coming through with the superior approach. And Vitality versus C9 was the first time we really kind of see this like hard engage versus disengage, re-engage working out really well. And I would really like to see sort of how the Nocturne is more incorporated as well, because you saw against Gen G, for example, they used Nocturne plus Hecarim, and people sort of ask, okay, is his Hecarim really a good counter to Aatrox? But it's more to do with how Nocturne and Hecarim react to Aatrox, because super hard split pushers like Aatrox's occasionally do not like Nocturne. Nocturne just really ruins their day, and that's why, even though Echo was a good answer that Vitality had in this game as well, it was not the most optimal, and it was still hard for Echo to really push past River. And that was also probably contributed to why Jizuke was joining more fights than you would expect. It was just not comfortable to play out against Nocturne. To me, C9 are really setting the standard after Vitality already kind of threw a huge wrench in what people were expecting the standard to be. And I'm looking forward to see how teams sort of take a page out of both of these games, and if we get even further as evolution, because for me, this is kind of like the meta-defining moment of the tournament so far, and I'm looking super forward to seeing the rest of group stage.